Hello and welcome to another lecture of Econ 2302, Principles of Microeconomics. This lecture covers Chapter 6 of your book, which is Market Efficiency and Government Intervention. Up until now, we've simply looked at the supply and demand curve as a point of equilibrium for the consumer and the producer. However, we know that the wealth created on each end, the producer wealth and the consumer wealth, is not equal for everybody involved. It's just equal for the market efficiency as far as that equilibrium. And so we're going to actually look at it a little bit closer and see how the wealth is spread out. And then we're also going to look and see what happens when the government actually intervenes and decides to set price ceilings or price floors on particular items. So let's look at efficiency first. We need to be able to define it in order to talk about it. So efficiency is just a situation in which people do the best they can given their limited resources. Remember, we believe in economics that people behave rationally in their self-interest, so they're going to maximize their own utility, and the business is the same way, and they're going to maximize their profit, and therefore they're going to do the best they can given their limited amounts of resources. This is just a fancy way of restating the principle of voluntary exchange. By now, you should have this memorized and know it frontwards and backwards. It's pretty simple. Principle of voluntary exchange just states that a voluntary exchange between two parties or two people makes both better off. Pay close attention, like I've said before, to the fact that it's voluntary. That means you can't force someone to buy a product, and you can't force someone to produce a product. In communist Russia and China, they actually forced their populace to produce particular items that the government saw fit. And this is what's known as a centrally planned economy. And when it's to the point of communism, we see that we don't get efficiency. They're not going to produce, let's just say in Russia, tanks at a fast, efficient rate because they have no incentive to do so. It's not voluntary. Alright, so a market equilibrium will generate the largest possible surplus when four conditions are met. Now, what I want you to know about these four conditions essentially is that we are essentially getting the most surplus we possibly can. That doesn't mean that the surplus is going to be provided equally to everybody. One thing that we haven't really touched on and we're going to touch on in this chapter is the fact that not everybody benefits the same way because not everybody has the same income. You know, the last chapter we talked about price sensitivity. If you're really, really, really rich, I'm not talking about millionaire rich. If you're a billionaire, you're probably not price sensitive when it comes to yachts. I would love to have my own yacht. It'd be awesome. However, I can't afford a yacht. That's probably going to be more than what I pay for a house. It doesn't make sense. I'm very price sensitive. However, if I was Bill Gates and I could afford a yacht, then really, if you lowered the price of a yacht by $10,000, it doesn't mean that I'm going to buy more or less yachts. It's very inelastic. So essentially, when we're talking about that, what we realize with price sensitivity is that wealth is not spread out, and another term for it is surplus, and we're going to look at that in a second. It's not spread out equally among every party, and that's okay. That's just going to happen with the market and efficient free market. The more you work, the more money you have, the more means you have, and therefore you can buy various things. That does not mean, though, and this is very critical, that doesn't mean that everybody has different levels of utility. We still state that people are rational in their own self-interest and they're going to maximize utility, and we're going to look at that more in the coming chapters, but everybody's still going to be able to maximize their utility. It just means that their wealth might change a little bit and not be spread out equally among everybody. Alright, so let's look at these four conditions that are able to create the most surplus. The first is no external benefits. The benefits of a product are confined to the person who pays for it. Essentially, if I buy something, let's just say I bought a TV, and you benefited from that TV. I don't understand how you might be able to, but let's just say that by me buying a TV, you were able to come over to my house at any time and get that TV and watch that TV. Well, because of that, you no longer have the inclination to go buy that TV. Now, obviously, we've created surplus and we voluntarily exchanged, we created wealth. I have a TV, I get to watch it, and the place that I bought the TV from, let's just say it's Walmart, has more money, they've increased their profit, so everything is good. Well, in reality, we're still leaving some surplus out there because you haven't bought a TV. And as long as you can benefit from watching my TV, we're not getting as much surplus as possible. Now, there is a point in which they can lower the price enough that you will go buy a TV, and therefore we will generate more surplus. That's just an external benefit. Another good example of this is, let's just say that I don't benefit per se by paying taxes in Plainview, Texas, and directly. I'm going to say I don't benefit directly. Paying housing taxes that go to support the school. I don't have a child that's in elementary school or high school or junior high school yet, and I'm paying taxes for that. So there are external benefits that go to other people, and therefore I personally don't get that surplus. What I want you to pay close attention to this is it's not necessarily that there isn't surplus and wealth created, because indirectly I do get something from it. More human capital for everybody means more wages, etc., etc., etc. But what I'm saying is, because there's external benefits for other people than the people directly involved, we're not getting the most surplus that we would typically get in an efficient market. Okay, enough said on that without getting very macro. Let's talk about no external costs. The cost of producing a product is confined to the person who sells it. In other words, we have the most efficient outcome if the person producing the good is actually paying to produce the good. In other words, let's just say that you had a typical crop, and this crop in the United States, let's just say, is cotton. And cotton is subsidized by the United States government. Also, you have crop insurance. And we know that because you have crop insurance and you also have subsidies, you aren't as inclined to produce as much cotton as possible. Now, I know this hits home and we are in cotton country, so a lot of people might be saying, wait a second, don't pick on the cotton industry. You can also talk about Medicare and things like that, where you're not inclined to give the best service, cut prices, things like that, because some of the production is paid for by people or parties other than yourself. In the case of the cotton industry, part of the cost is picked up by the taxpayer. So while you're going to try to maximize your profit, obviously, and get as much as possible, you don't have that same burden as paying for everything yourself. The government's intervened. They've said this is a market failure. That's all debatable. But what I'm getting at is the maximum amount of surplus is not going to be there because we're no longer in an efficient market where it's limited to the producer and the consumer. There's outside external costs. Likewise with Medicare, if the hospital doesn't have to pay for everything, let's just say, and for the Medicare recipient, because of cost and taxpayers are funding that, then they're not going to cut their costs in corners as much as they probably would likewise and lower prices to equilibrium. The whole point of these four things is that we're not getting the largest amount of surplus. We're still getting surplus, and it's spread differently. But the whole point is that a market equilibrium will generate the largest surplus when these four things are met. Thirdly is perfect information. This is a really big one for me. I studied it thoroughly getting my master's degree in finance and economics. We talked about Enron exhaustively, and so I'm going to talk about Enron quickly here. So perfect information is where buyers and sellers know enough about a product to make informed decisions on whether to buy or sell it. This is also in investments, right? This really goes into investments, and this is how buyers are able to be confident in good, and it's also how sellers or producers are able to raise money. Think of it this way. If I think Enron's doing really, really well, I'm going to invest in that company. However, if they're not providing information where I know that it's a good company, or I know that it's a bad company and they're lying about their product, I'm giving them money and I shouldn't be. Or as a buyer, I'm paying much, much more for a product than I should be. And so we're not getting the most surplus. And this is how perfect information works. Perfect competition. Each firm produces such a small quantity that the firm cannot affect the price. We don't want to have a monopoly or anybody be able to control the price enough to where, or the quantity, that they can stop producing and increase price. A good example of this, those of you who live in Lubbock, LP&L, they control the electricity for the most part. There's not much competition. They own a monopoly, and therefore they can essentially say we're either going to give you less electricity or we are going to increase the price. You don't have any control of that because you can't go to another electrical company. There's no competition there. All right, let's move on. We've talked about the efficiency part plenty. Let's talk about the producer part. The consumer part, and how we create wealth from a consumer point of view. Willingness to pay. This is the maximum amount a consumer is willing to pay for a product. This is the maximum amount you personally are willing to pay for a particular item. It varies from each individual. There's not one willingness to pay. However, this is really poignant because we're going to look at it in just a second, how surplus is created. That doesn't mean that a business could charge different prices for each individual. If I'm willing to pay more for a particular item, let's just say it's a candy bar. I really like this candy bar. I'm willing to pay more, and you're not willing to pay as much. If I go to the local grocery store, convenience store, they're not going to say, Mr. Kemper, how much are you willing to pay? We're going to set the price at this much. They're going to set it at a certain price equilibrium that they've determined, and if I'm willing to pay more, I'm going to get what's known as consumer surplus. This is the amount a consumer is willing to pay for a product minus the price the consumer actually pays. Now, I'm not going to make you actually calculate this out. I'm just going to make sure that you conceptually understand it, because I will ask questions on the exam about it. You should be able to understand where the consumer surplus is and where you can see it on a demand and supply curve. Supply and demand curve, and we're going to look at that in just a second. But just think of it this way. If I'm willing to pay $2 for a candy bar, and you are only willing to pay $1 for a candy bar, and they charge $1 for a candy bar, I essentially got $1 more than what I was willing to pay, or essentially I have surplus or wealth. So how does this look like translated into our demand curve and supply curve? So let's look at the demand curve because we're talking about the consumer, remember. And these are a few individuals, and you can find this figure in your book at 6.1. Feel free to go there and look at it. What we're looking at right now is people that are willing to pay for their lawn to be cut and per hour. So how much they're willing to pay for someone to or cut their lawn. Juan here is willing to pay $22 per hour, and I'm going to initiate my whiteboard app. It'll take a second to start. This is the first time I've used it, and hopefully it works smoothly. While it's starting up, I'll talk about this curve. Juan is willing to pay $22. Meanwhile, let's see if I can. So Juan is willing to pay 22. Tupac is willing to pay 19. Thurl is willing to pay 16. Forrest is willing to pay 13. And Favolia is willing to pay 10. Don't ask me about the names. I guess the the writers of this book are fans of 90s music, and to that I applaud them because I am also a fan of Tupac. However, I'm not teaching to students who are fans of 90s music per se, but let's just put it that way. That tells you how old Mr. Kemper is. I grew up in the late 90s. All right. Juan here, he's willing to pay $22. However, the price is set at $10. He essentially gets $12 in surplus, right? Because 22 minus 10, pretty simple. What we calculate there in that purple bar graph is his surplus, which equates to $12. Tupac here, the difference between 10 and 19, and Thurl, the difference between 16 and 10, and Forrest. All of this is consumer surplus because each individual person's willing to pay differently than the next person. So Juan's willing to pay a lot of money. Favolia, right down here, is not. She personally is willing to pay only $10, and this particular lawn service deemed that the price equilibrium right here intersected at $10, and they're willing to provide this quantity and at a price of $10. So everybody else who's willing to pay more, they're essentially given surplus. Oops, let me go back real quickly. If you'll see, the book actually goes on to say that Siggy here, once again, don't ask me where they got the names, Siggy is willing to pay $7. Now, if the market equilibrium states that we hit a optimal point of $10 and 5 lawns cut, well, Siggy here, he is not going to be able to get his lawn cut. He's willing to pay $7, but this place is not willing to cut 6 lawns at $7. Their max is 5 for $10 per hour. So Siggy just doesn't get the good. He's, you might say, very price sensitive. All right, so now let's look at the producer side. Producer is willing to accept. Remember, we just talked about the consumer, which is willing to pay. This is willingness to accept. And the producer, their willingness to accept is the minimum amount that they are willing to receive or accept as payment for a product. It's also equal, and pay close attention to this because I probably will ask a question on the exam about it. It's also equal to the marginal cost of production. Why is that? Trick question. Well, it shouldn't be a trick question. By now you should probably know it. They're not going to accept a price that's lower than marginal cost and therefore actually lose money. Marginal cost is where they break even. And we're going to look at that more in later chapters, but remember, marginal cost equals marginal benefit. At that point, they've hit price equilibrium. They're not going to keep producing and selling you an item if it costs them more money than what they get. All right, so we talked about consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the price a producer receives for a product minus the cost of production. And why it's production, remember, it's the point at which marginal cost equals marginal benefit. So we're looking at the supply curve now. And where does the wealth get created? Well, it's on the bottom half. So essentially, what we're looking at in this particular graph, as my whiteboard starts up again, is all the people who are willing to cut the lawns, right? And what they're willing to work for. Essentially, the amount that they are, each individual is willing to accept in this particular market. We're not talking about a specific business in this case. And Abe here, he's actually willing to work for not very much, just $2 an hour. That's fairly low in my own view, but Abe is willing to work only $2 an hour, and 2 minus the $10 he gets, because that's where the market equilibrium is, he has $8 an hour in surplus. We see Bia here, I think that's how you pronounce it. She's willing to work for 4, which equates to a $6 surplus. And my writing is not very pretty on this. We also see Cecil here. He's got a surplus. We see D has a surplus. And if we were to go even further, as my whiteboard changes, let's see. Uh-oh, not good. So if we were going just a little bit further, we could see that Eve here is willing to only accept $10, and she gets $10. And so therefore, she gets actually no surplus. Abe here, he creates some wealth. So that's where we would see the surplus. Efren here, he is only willing to cut lawns at $12 an hour, and at a price of $10 an hour for the market, he will not get any business. Essentially, he's got to figure out how to cut some of his production costs in order to hit the equilibrium point. So if we were going to put it all together, this is what it would look like. On the exam, I want you to be able to identify where the surpluses are. I will probably put up a picture, and I'll say label or the shaded area. It might be the top of the graph or the bottom of the graph. Is this consumer surplus? Is this producer surplus? Well, the sum of all consumer and producer surplus is called total surplus. You will need to know that for the exam. And essentially, this is just wealth created. So the government can intervene. And when they intervene, they can do one of two things when we're talking about prices. They can set a price ceiling or a price floor. A price ceiling is the maximum amount that a particular business or industry is able to charge for an item. A price floor is the minimum amount set by the government. Now you might be asking, why would they ever set a price floor? Wouldn't we want goods to be as cheap as possible? Well, in this case, what we're talking about is something like cotton, agriculture, wheat, beef, milk, things like that, where we want the industry to keep going, and the government decided that if we don't set a price floor, people are going to stop buying, and it's going to get so cheap that the industry has to go away, and therefore we're essentially bringing in all of our agriculture, we're importing it, and the government says, well, we would rather have still the majority of our agriculture produced here. Efficiency in the visible hand. This is one of my favorite things. It's from one of my favorite economists, the father of modern economics, Adam Smith. And he said that the invisible hand essentially is this market regulator that we don't see. And what it does is it brings in and lowers prices or raises prices, specifically lowers them when there's too much surplus. So if businesses are getting too much money, the invisible hand will bring that price all back in. And we will see that because people are guided by their self-interest, other businesses are going to produce cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And so we'll essentially see the most amount of surplus we can get in an efficient market. However, excuse me, in modern economies, we see that most governments still take an active role and they don't allow for the market to just control itself. So think of the invisible hand as just the market controlling itself. So in the event of a market failure, such as banks making really bad loans, which we saw in the Great Recession, to people who can afford them, what the invisible hand would say, and Adam Smith would say, is that those banks should fail. They made really bad loans, and they should just fail. Instead, we saw the government say, well, if they fail, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, a lot of people will lose money, and therefore we're going to bail them out. Adam Smith would say, it's okay, in the long run, everything will correct itself. People will no longer make those bad loans, and people won't bank at those risky banks. However, in modern economics, governments take a very active role. And we're going to see at what exactly this happens. And for a market that meets the four efficiency conditions, the market equilibrium still creates the total surplus. So government intervention can actually decrease the surplus and cause some inefficiency. So what are some areas in which the government sets maximum prices? I talked already about some minimum prices. Well, they may say rental housing, for instance, in New York, they have capped a lot of the rents, and what we see is rent ceiling put on, it's also known as a rent freeze, put on various homes because, and apartments actually in New York, they can't build any more buildings because they've grown as a city so much that the skyscrapers are just going up and up and up. And because of that, there's not any more supply and the demand just keeps increasing. Tenants are being forced to pay way more than what they probably can afford. And so the government has gone in and said, we're going to put a cap, a ceiling on rental income, on rental prices. Gasoline, this is more in the case of a natural disaster, such as Katrina or something like that, in which gasoline just spikes and it's price gouging, and so the government will initiate what's known as a price gouging rule and therefore a ceiling on gasoline. Medical goods and services, specifically when the government's paying for them, when it's Medicare or Medicaid, the government likes to put caps on it because we don't want to just do every single test for someone who doesn't probably need all the tests. But because of this, it will cause what's known as inefficiency, also known as deadweight loss. So what you are seeing here, and I'm going to try my whiteboard again, give it a second to start up. What you're seeing here, essentially, had my previous slide info. What you're seeing here is known as deadweight loss, this yellow portion right there. What the government says, instead of setting the price right here on an apartment at $400, we believe that the price should stay at $300. Because of that, some of this producer surplus is going to be cut out. And what we see is the price will hit our supply point right there, and that's our equilibrium. And this goes up from that point. We still have consumer surplus. And in fact, we have a little bit more consumer surplus. Not much, but a little bit more consumer surplus. And that's because we have people that are able to get their apartment that typically wouldn't be able to get their apartment. And people who are willing to pay a lot more for their apartment that are getting it at a cheaper rate. And this yellow portion is known as deadweight loss. It's just surplus that's left out there, and we're very inefficient, and therefore not all the wealth that could be created is allowed to be created. Now, why would the government do that? Well, like I said before, they don't want to essentially price out those tenants in the particular apartments or houses that can't afford it, and they have jobs that are lower paying jobs but still want to live there. Essentially what we're doing is rent control and trying to give them more consumer surplus and eliminate the producer surplus. There we go. It didn't freeze up like it did last time. Good deal. All right, so this is deadweight loss. This is the decrease in total surplus of the market that results from a policy such as rent control. Deadweight loss from taxation, the difference between the total burden of tax and the amount of revenue collected by the government. Well, what happens is because some people pay a lot more taxes than others, we see what's known as inefficiency. Not everybody is going to pay the same amount of taxes, and the burden doesn't fall on everybody. Some people don't even pay any taxes. Well, the government deems that's okay, but one of the negative externalities or negative outcomes because of this is some deadweight loss. We're not as efficient as we possibly could be. The government says, well, we can live with some inefficiency, and therefore some people get more surplus and others don't get the same amount. Excess burden of a tax, just another name for deadweight loss. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is jkemper@southplainscollege.edu. You can also hit me up at Twitter at Mr. Kemper, MrKemper. Thank you and have a nice day.